Why did Buddha teach anatman, no self, absence of self? What moved Buddha to teach, or early Buddhists to teach, that there is no self? Why was this lesson not taught before? One might say nobody realized it before. But then something happened. What made it so that a teaching was found to be perhaps necessary, important, to spread? In response to what precisely is Buddha speaking, if he is speaking at all, or those who speak for him, right? Well, let us consider what is before Buddha, before what we call Buddhism. And we see that there is a tradition of priests, a priestly religion of the Brahmins. And the Brahmins are these priests who function in a hierarchy, and they represent the gods for the people. They're in charge of temples, and they're tied to a whole cosmos. Everything is ordered, and it is said that everything is a manifestation, ultimately, of mind, consciousness, thought. The world is a dream, samsara. Well, and we seek liberation in the divine. Now, some of these priests, at some point in their life, would abstract themselves from their ordinary duties within this cosmology, one might say. The cosmological order, the order of all things. They would abstract themselves, become hermits, and seek liberation aside from the established order of things, social order, political order, including theological political order, right? And so they might go in the wilderness, and they might look back upon the city, as it were, upon the order where you have people, priests, gods, the whole thing, the universe, and they would say, well, we want to commune directly with the divine. Direct communion with the divine without having now to be stuck in this hierarchy that we were raised in. Now these ex-priests, one might call them, now turned into hermits, seek communion with the Absolute. Now, seeking communion with the Absolute, they have the tendency to look down upon all other people who are lost in this samsaric, we might say, world where of rebirth, of change, of the flux of phenomena and so forth, of appearances. Because they're seeking truth, and nothing but the truth, the naked truth, whereas everybody else is stuck with the appearance of truth. Now these people who go out there are monastic, one might say, in the strict sense. They're hermits. They are one, each being in communion or seeking communion with the one. Each one is an atman, we might say. And this atman is one, seeking communion with the Brahman, this the oneness that is behind the whole universe. When Siddhartha comes onto the scene in traditional stories and awakens, he awakens out of a dream, we might say, that includes that of the hermit who had abstracted himself as one. Hence the lesson about anatman, about the absence of this one. So, what does this teaching teach? It teaches not that there is absolutely not a self, but that this self is, well, as they usually say today, conditioned. That it is a kind of facade for factors at work beneath it, underneath it, behind it. So, what the Buddha is teaching in this case, and by Buddha we should understand mind itself. Buddha is awakening. So, what the awakening of the mind teaches, or the awakened mind teaches, the mind speaks, is that the self, including the self of Siddhartha, the one Atman, is a mask. That therefore there is no salvation in it. Salvation, or ultimate liberation from illusion, is found behind the mask. So we might say in Vijnana, Alaya Vijnana, they have various terms, mind, thought, which somehow produces the self. So the human being in tradition would be considered a shadow of a divine self, which is a god. And so you have various gods in the ancient traditions, and all of them somehow reflect an overarching or underlying consciousness. Man is a shadow of a god who is the mask, or mirror even, of mind. Buddha is recovering, or the early Buddhists are recovering this understanding by emphasizing that the mind that is behind all things is not to be communed with aside from the gods. Because with the hermits, we have a bypassing of the whole order, including the gods. So now we have a kind of solution to the theater of life. We have a bypassing of that theater, direct communion with the mind. And Buddha, by saying, no, there is no self, is addressing these hermits who had posited themselves as the one in communion with the one of the universe, or behind the universe. So the doctrine of anatman, of no self, is telling us, in effect, that we should be going, or the hermit should be going back within that order to discover therein mind. Mind is at work, or is to be understood, discovered properly within the order of things, not outside of the order. So in order to return to mind, we're not to escape the dream of life. We are to see it rather as a mirror, as a poetic mirror of truth. We don't have to escape duty. No. The dharma, the law of things, is a reflection, a direct reflection. Once we meet it, we meet its demands in the element of reflection, not in a compulsive manner. We see that it is a reflection of mind or consciousness. And what is more, and this is awakening, this is Buddha. The self is now explicitly exposed to its ground. The self is nothing more than a determination of mind, which is not determined. It is, one might say, an inexhaustible abyss, which doesn't mean chaos. It means that it is the absolute order of things. Whence we have the various selves or determinations. So every time there is an I, this I is just a determination of thought. Now, why would thought determine itself? Is it bad for thought? Well, there is no standard to say that it's bad. Mind is the standard. So it's good. The question now, however, is whether this thought or consciousness can fall into its own determinations and mistaken itself for its determinations. And so again here, the teaching of no self. No self means, wait, thought is deluded. Thought is distracted. Thought has gone astray, has remained bogged down in one of its determinations or self-determinations. These determinations have to be exposed to their ground. Now the determination of thought, of consciousness, of mind, right, is seen as representing that mind. It bespeaks the mind. Or in it, rather, mind speaks itself. There is no longer any alienation. Right? We don't have this, the world of conventions as an obstacle, as a cave, as a dream world, a prison that we have to escape in order to return to truth. The world is a mirror of truth, and that involves challenges. Duty comes to us as a challenge to return. We return in terms of a journey, facing challenges. Courage is essential. In Christian terms, it is through the cross that you find resurrection, not by avoiding the cross. So you face it. And this facing involves a process of purgation, of course, of self. So the self now is recognized as a mirror of truth. Ironically, in the modern world, we have a resurgence on a global plane of Buddhism. whereby everyone is positing himself and saying, look, we have to work on consciousness. We have to fix consciousness. I, self-help. I want to be enlightened. I need, I. So now we have a Buddhism about myself, self-help. It's all about my feelings, my super self, my super ego, my higher self, right? And so now we need to purge consciousness, purge minds, fix mind, control, master even mind, in order to establish ourselves in our purity, peacefulness, glee, joy. But we are a mask, says Buddha. We are a mask of consciousness. Consciousness does not need you to fix it. It is consciousness that is at work, and if anything, it fixes the self by exposing its illusory character vis-a-vis thought. In other words, its poetic character, which doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it is not an end in itself, that the determination of thought is not the end game, that it's not what consciousness is all about. Consciousness speaks, bespeaks itself, manifests itself by way of returning to itself. What about the modern self then? The modern self, compliments of the likes of Machiavelli, then Descartes and others, the ego, the superego even. The modern self posits itself as the pinnacle of consciousness, as the pinnacle of evolution that establishes a new world, a world of freedom, of emancipation, consummate freedom, a realm of freedom, beyond the limitations, the natural limitations of mind. The self now becomes the building block of a new world. Of course, Buddha is not teaching this. He's teaching a return to the primal thought, out of which the order of the universe, which includes the gods, men, heroes, unfolds and remains what it is, a natural mirror of truth. Instead of seeing the world, the natural world, which natural world includes the gods, the heroes, the men, and everything around it, as a mirror of truth, as a manifestation even of truth, in the respect that there is a path. It constitutes a kind of path of purgation of the determinations of consciousness back to the absolute form, the unlimited limit of the universe. With the modern, we have consciousness that freezes itself in the ego and then tries to posit its ideal end as a super ego, super self, superior self, ultimate, higher self, on the way to establishing a new world, that no longer mirrors a given truth. This is an essential difference, one might say, between the classical world and the modern world. And so today, all discourse tends to be about self-expression, all about me, myself, my feelings. We take pictures to feel better. We work to achieve ourselves. It's all about me, my point of view, my success. And the classical path of purgation is all but forgotten. This, for the classics, is delusion. We see consciousness as a function of ourselves, and not ourselves as a function of consciousness. And when this happens, we need not to return to consciousness as a cradle. We need to anchor ourselves in a society that allows us to advance this work of purgation of consciousness, of mind. We need to polish this mind. Whereas for the classics, you do not need to polish the mind. The mind is already pure and luminous and bright. So you have to recognize that you are not you, that you are not there, that you are a mask, that you're an illusion, that you are the result of consciousness having determined itself. So when someone says, I, it is really consciousness, it is thought, it is mind that says, I, and that somehow, often, today, forgets what it is and remains stuck in this I, and then tries to solve problems within this I. But the problem is the I. You cannot build a solution, a real solution, on the basis of the problem. And yet the problem of the self, is a kind of non-problem in itself, or it is a problem of thought, in the respect that it is something to be interpreted on the way back to the purity, to the original purity of mind. So now we see, hopefully we see a little better, in the respect that we are less ourselves and more thought, reflection itself. Anatman, no self. There is no self as a solution. There is no self as a foundation of life. There is no self as the source, root of consciousness. It is not I who decides. And so, in Christian terms, it is not I who live, but the Logos that emanates directly from the divine mind that speaks in me.